Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to Church History, part 5, 6, or 7, depending on how you count. And just to summarize, we started off with Jerusalem as the birth of Christianity, and then obviously it spreads to Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome, where you have the 5 holy sees. We discussed the spread of Islam into the Middle East, which removed Christianity from most of the Near East, up until the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. And after that, we went into Luther. But this time, we'll be discussing how the Holy Roman Emperor attempted to take on his rival in France. And there's a curious line in this book, which talks about how Sweden, Norway, and Finland and Russia were not great countries yet. They were still supposedly in the Dark Ages. But also we'll go into wars in Tunis and Algiers, where there were pirates along the Mediterranean that France had to go subdue. But the reason I'm going into that is because the map that I have ready beforehand, same as last time, it does not have North Africa well illustrated, so this way you can understand the context when I just show it. And neither is Spain here. England is really not demonstrated too well, and certainly not Scandinavia and such. So this is how you would familiarize yourself. There is Sweden and Scandinavia, and there is North Africa, including Tunisia and Algeria, and there's Britain and Ireland, and of course that is Spain and Portugal, and also Istanbul would be over here, right around Greece and Turkey. But this is mostly a European history. And again, I would emphasize the reason I love this book is because I never really liked European history. I thought it was a boring history of kings and queens who were all interrelated. And I have very much found that it is not boring at all when you have a good book. So I'm delighted to share this with you and to go over what's going on. What we've discussed so far was how feudalism and scholasticism and ecclesiastical corruptions and papal infallibility and the sale of indulgences and the corruptions of the church caused the necessity for reform. And we also discussed in prior episodes about the early life of Luther, his struggles, the 95 Propositions, Erasmus, Melanchthon, and Leo X, the Leipzig Disputation, and Luther's Elements of Greatness. Finally, the Diet of Worms and his imprisonment, leading to the Zwingli controversy and the Diet of Augsburg, the League of Smalcald, and the death of Luther. But we're going to rewind the clock a little bit in discussing Emperor Charles V. And this is a great thing to have in an introduction. But Charles V was ruler of what's now Germany, and he was always at war with Francis in France, Francis II. And so we will be, most of this, if you could summarize this chapter or this lecture, it would be wars between Charles and Francis. Finally, there's like 3 truces, at least in this chapter. The hostilities cease and renew, probably 4. Finally, the Council of Trent is held to combat the Lutheran heresy. And then you have the character of Charles, and there's a lot of plot twists. So this is very useful for understanding this part of church history. And this is the Holy Roman Empire. This would be what we call Czechoslovakia today, but there were a lot more Germans in there because there wasn't a population transfer. So it is the European German state of Bohemia. Bavaria is to the south, so that's Munich and Augsburg. Then you have Thuringia, and see, Thuringia is probably the most important region, other than, if you remember from the lecture last time, Saxony was where Luther's mentor, or more like patron was. He was Frederick the Elector of Saxony, and I'm forgetting the capital city, but this is pretty much the most cultural, Leipzig. It's the most cultural gem of Germany, and you can argue that. But major cities for Germany today would be Hamburg, Cologne, Frankfurt, Munich. Zurich would be part of Switzerland, but it's still part of the Holy Roman Empire at this point. Here's the Council of Trent. There's Venice. Obviously, Rome is here. Milan and Florence. And then we have the state of Burgundy, which actually is on both sides. I learned while kind of looking this up. And also we have Savoy, which is important, and Orleans. The emperor was from Flanders, as we'll see, which is the Netherlands. I may actually have this on the wrong side of the border. But really, this Europe becomes a very interesting map when you look at it from the point of view of 500 years ago. And yet you still see a lot of the regions that we would... Well, he writes... This is such a great introduction, so I may as well start. So, the Emperor Charles V. When Luther appeared on the stage, the great monarchies of Europe had just arisen upon the ruins of those feudal states which survived the wreck of Charlemagne's empire. The Emperor of Germany, of all the European monarchs, had the greatest claim to the antiquity and dignity of his throne. So I had to look up all these locations. As hereditary sovereign of Austria, Styria, Carinthia, and Tyrol. And to emphasize, this is all basically Austria today. So it would be probably this part of Germany. So this guy, Charles V, he was already in charge of many important lands. He had absolute authority in his feudal provinces, while as an elected emperor, he had indirect influence over Saxony, the Palatine, and the 3 archbishoprics of Treves, Mentz, and Cologne. Treves has a different name, Mentz has a different name, and Cologne, and some Burgundian territories. And so this is actually a good opportunity because not only was he pretty important, but he also was very influential in the Rhineland, which is the Palatine also in modern-day Germany. So he was already a very powerful guy, and Cologne is up here. So you could see... Where did it say? Right. So he was hereditary sovereign of Austria. So this is the border of Germany and Austria. So you can see he was from a very powerful family, and therefore it's not hard to imagine why he would become the Holy Roman Emperor. And some Burgundian territory. So again, Burgundy is over here, and he probably... Empires were more split up back then, or like family holdings. The most powerful monarchy at this time was probably that of France, and its capital was the finest city in Europe, and the resort of the learned and elegant from all parts of Christendom. All strangers extolled the splendor of the palace, the wealth of the nobles, and the fame of the university. The power of the monarch was nearly absolute, and a considerable standing army even then was ready to obey his commands. So here we're talking about France. Maybe I want to switch to a different color, but it may not work. So I'll just thatch it. So you have the elector of... He was the hereditary ruler of these lands, but he becomes ruler of Germany. We're not up there yet. And then his rival becomes France. And so France is a powerful kingdom, and it's the only one that's able to put up a resistance to the Holy Roman Empire. And the other funny thing is, though, these are both, well, there's no, the Protestant Reformation comes later, but there's no Catholic, they're both Catholic powers, ostensibly. And yet we'll see it sometimes they help the Protestant when it suits them. But again, to emphasize, this is basically Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire, at war with France. And Germany is ruled by Charles V, and France is ruled by Francis II. And that's the whole lecture will be these two powers going to war with each other. Spain at the beginning of the 16th century was ruled by Ferdinand and Isabella, who by their marriage had united the crowns of Castile and Aragon. The conquest of Granada and the discovery of America had added greatly to the political importance of Spain and laid the foundations of its future greatness under Philip II. England, from its insular position, had not so much influence in European politics as the other powers to which allusion has been made, but it was, nevertheless, a flourishing and united kingdom. Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor house, sat on the throne and was successful in suppressing the power of the feudal nobility and in increasing the royal authority. So if you didn't know, England would be here. And the funny thing is, it's not too important in this entire lecture. And the reason is because he's about to tell us. Kings in the 15th century were the best protectors of the people and aided them in their struggles against their feudal oppressors. England, however, had made but little advance in commerce or manufactures, and the people were still rude and ignorant. The clergy, as in other countries, were the most intelligent and wealthy portion of the population, and consequently the most influential, though disgraced by many vices. Italy, then as now, was divided into many independent states. So this book was published in 1849. That's why when I first read that, I had to look it up. But Italy is probably hundreds of small kingdoms, and it's not a united country at all. So Corsica, Sardinia, Venice is over here, and it's certainly probably the most powerful city-state. And we'll see actually the Holy Roman Emperor actually blesses Venice with some kind of autonomy. But meanwhile, you also have the cities of Rome, Milan, Florence. So all these are mercantile cities with a lot of influence. Italy, then as now, was divided into many independent states and distracted by civil and religious dissensions. The Duchy of Milan was ruled by Ludovico Moro, son of the celebrated Francis Sforza. Naples, called a kingdom, had just been conquered by the French. I think Naples is more up here. Florence was under the sway of the Medici, pretty sure that's Florence, whose commercial importance had begun to decline. Venice, whose commercial importance had begun to decline, was controlled by an oligarchy of nobles. So that's Venice, and I managed to label that. This chair of St. Peter, the Pope, was filled by Pope Alexander VI, a pontiff who has obtained an infamous immortality by the vices of debauchery, cruelty, and treachery. He was a bad pope. The papacy was probably in its most corrupt state, and those who had the control of its immense patronage disregarded the loud call for reformation, which was raised in every corner of Christendom. So again, this is before Luther's nailing of the 95 Theses. The popes were intent upon securing temporal as well as spiritual power, and levied oppressive taxes on both their spiritual and temporal subjects. The great northern kingdoms of Europe, which are now so considerable, Russia, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, did not at the beginning of the 16th century attract much attention. They were plunged in barbarism and despotism, and the light of science or religion rarely penetrated into the interior. Again, we're talking about the Scandinavian countries and Russia. So this is a diss that they were not civilized. The monarchs were sensual and cruel. The nobles profligate, they spent a lot of money, and rapacious. The clergy ignorant and corrupt, and the people degraded yet insensible to their degradation, with no aspirations for freedom and no appreciation for the benefits of civilization. Such heroes, future great kings, such as Peter and Gustavus Adolphus, had not yet appeared, nor were these northern nations destined to be immediately benefited by the impulse which the Reformation gave. So the Reformation was good for them, with the exception of Sweden, then the most powerful of these kingdoms. Sweden is that one. I looked it up before I recorded this. The Greek Empire became extinct when Constantinople was taken by the Turks in 1453. So this is off our map, but that's Constantinople. Used to be the capital of the Greco-Roman Empire, and it was taken by the Turks. But it took them like 700 years, not for lack of trying. At the close of the 15th century, the Turkish arms were very powerful, and Europe again trembled before the Muslims. Greece and the whole of Western Asia were obedient to the Sultan, but his power did not reach its culminating point until a century afterwards. Such were the various states of Europe when the Reformation broke out. Maximilian was Emperor of Germany, and Charles V had just inherited from his father, Philip the Fair, who had married a daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Kingdom of Spain, in addition to the dominion of the Netherlands. So Maximilian was his father. By the death of Maximilian in 1519, the youthful sovereign of Spain and the Netherlands came into possession of the Austrian dominions, and the electors shortly after chose him as Emperor of Germany. So again, to categorize, his father was ruler of Spain and the Netherlands. And these were always regions that were fighting for independence. So at some point, as soon as his father dies, he becomes elected. He was born at Ghent, Anno Domini 1500, and was educated with great care. He early displayed his love of government, and at 15 was present at the deliberations of the cabinet. But he had no taste for learning, and gave but few remarks of that genius which he afterwards evinced. He was much attached to his Flemish subjects, and during the first year of his reign gave great offense to the grandees, that's the armies, of Spain and the nobles of Germany by his marked partiality for those men who had been his early companions. So he was born in Flanders, which is around there, and he always kind of preferred those people, and that kind of made the rest of his empire. Also, we should kind of add, he was kind of ruler of Spain. So this would be part of the dominion of our Holy Roman Emperor. He's not elected yet, but we're almost there. And also the Netherlands. Well, that was territorially his. So again, he always loved this region because he was from there. I hope that's good. It is difficult to trace in the career of Charles V any powerful motives of conduct, separate from the desire of aggrandizement. He just wants to become more and more powerful. And that's pretty much the motif of the entire chapter. The interests of the church with which he was identified and the true welfare of his subjects were at different times, sacrificed to his ambition. Had there been no powerful monarchs on the other thrones of Europe, his dreams of power might have been realized. But at this period, there happened to be a constellation of princes. So he really wanted to rule all of Europe. And if it wasn't for Francis II of France, he might have succeeded. He was already very powerful. And if you notice, the Holy Roman Empire was the largest empire at the time in Europe. The greatest of these and the chief rival through the life of Charles was Francis I of France. He had even anticipated an election to the imperial crown, which would have made him more powerful than even Charles himself. So this is the funny thing. The Holy Roman Emperor was an elected position. So it's like a diet of all the nobles. And so it could have been, Charles is here. And then, this guy is Francis. Okay. And so, it looks like either the first or the second. I thought it was the second. But those two were competing. And then another guy who was running, his name was Frederick. And he was the elector of Saxony. But we'll see what happens to him. And if you remember from the prior video, he was Luther's patron. The electors feared both and chose Frederick of Saxony, but he declined the dangerous post. Charles, as Archduke of Austria, had such great and obvious claims that they could not be disregarded. He was therefore the fortunate candidate. So they wanted Frederick of Saxony, but Frederick said no thank you. And instead they made Charles because he was the more powerful person. But his election was a great disappointment to Francis, and he could not conceal his mortification. So Francis is not happy. Peace could not long subsist between two envious and ambitious princes. France was nearly the same age as Charles, and had inherited nearly despotic power, was free from financial embarrassment, and ruled over a united and loyal people. He was therefore no contemptible match for Charles. In addition, he strengthened himself by alliances with the Swiss and Venetians. Charles sought the favor of the Pope and Henry VIII of England. The real causes of war were mutual jealousies and passion for military glory. The assigned causes were that Charles did not respect the claims of France as King of Naples, and on the other hand, that Francis had seized the Duchy of Milan, which was a fief of the empire, and also retained the Duchy of Burgundy, the patrimonial inheritance of the emperor. So like I said, Burgundy is on both sides, and so they were fighting over certain territorial ambitions. I mean, they started out that way. Wait till you see how it ends. The political history of Europe for nearly half a century is a record of the wars between these two powerful princes, of their mutual disasters, disappointments, and successes. Other contests were involved in these, and there were also some which arose from causes independent of mutual jealousy, such as the revolt of the Spanish grandees, that's soldiers, of the peasants in Germany, and of the invasion of the empire by the Turks. During the reign of Charles was also the division of the princes in Germany on the grounds of religion, the foundation of the contest which after the death of Charles convulsed Germany for 30 years. But the 30 Years' War was a religious one, was one of the political consequences of the Reformation. The wars between Charles and Francis were purely wars of military ambition. Charles had greater territories and larger armies, but Francis had more money and more absolute control over his forces. Now that is a key distinction. He, the Holy Roman Emperor, he had a larger empire, probably more money and resources. But France was a united kingdom, and he was absolute ruler of France. He didn't need anybody else's permission, whereas the Holy Roman Empire always had to answer to the other nobles and princes. So it's kind of more effective to have a smaller force that's more under your control than it is to have a larger force that has to deal with squabbling nobles. Charles's power was checked in Spain by the free spirit of Cortes. I looked it up. I think that's Hernando Cortes. And in Germany by the independence of the princes and by the embarrassing questions which arose out of the Reformation. So Charles had to decide which religion his empire was going to be. Francis never had that problem. France was always a Catholic country. It would be tedious to read the various wars between Charles and his rival. Each of them gained at different times great successes, and each experienced in turn the most humiliating reverses. So you win, you lose, you win, you lose. Francis was even taken prisoner at the Battle of Pavia in 1525 and confined in a fortress at Madrid until he promised to the victors the complete dismemberment of France. So the French king was kidnapped, and he swore that he would give up his empire. An extorted promise he never meant to keep. No sooner had he recovered his liberty than he violated all his oaths, and Europe was again the scene of fresh hostilities. The passion of revenge was now added to that of ambition. And as the Pope had favored the cause of Francis, the generals of Charles invaded Italy. Rome was taken and sacked by Constable Bourbon, a French noble whom Francis had slighted, and now he was working for Charles, the Holy Roman Emperor. And cruelties and outrages were perpetrated by the imperial forces, which never disgraced Alaric or Attila. So he's saying the Huns never treated Rome as bad, or the Visigoths. What happened was, because the Pope was supporting Francis or France, the armies of the Holy Roman Empire had invaded Rome and kidnapped the Pope. And so that's a funny thing for a Catholic monarch to do. Charles pretended to be filled with grief in view of the victories of his generals, and pretended that they acted without his orders. He employed every artifice to deceive indignant Christendom. So everybody's offended, and he's lying. And appointed prayers and processions throughout Spain for the recovery of the Pope's liberty, which one stroke of his pen could have secured. Thus it was that the most Catholic and bigoted prince in Europe seized the Pope's person and sacked his city at the very time when Luther was prosecuting his reform. So this was a very timely distraction. The emperor who could have put down the Lutheran Reformation was busy attacking the Pope in Rome. So the author even writes here that it's really providence, or the hand of God, that's really determining all of this. And this fact shows how much more powerfully the emperor was influenced by political rather than by religious considerations. It also shows the providence of God in permitting the only men who could have arrested the Reformation to spend their strength in battling each other rather than the heresy which they deplored. Had Charles been less powerful and ambitious, he probably would have contented himself in punishing heretics, and in uniting with his natural ally, the Pope, in suppressing every insurrection which had for its objects the rights of conscience and enjoyment of popular liberty. The war was continued for 2 years longer between Francis and Charles, with great acrimony, but with various successes, both parties being at one time strengthened by alliances and then again weakened by desertions. It's a roller coaster, I'm warning you now. At last, both parties were exhausted and were willing to accede to terms which they had previously rejected with disdain. It's like the Brexit deal. Francis was the most weakened and disheartened, but Charles was the most perplexed. The troubles growing out of the Reformation demanded his attention, and the Turks at this period, a powerful nation, were about invading Austria. The Spaniards murmured at the unusual length of the war, and money was with difficulty obtained. So, Spain is here, and that's where the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V is getting his money from. And meanwhile, the Turks are attacking his kingdom, and it's called the invasion of Vienna. So, he has a Muslim onslaught to deal with. And the people in Spain are the ones probably paying for it, and you will see at some point they get sick of that. Hence, the Peace of Cambrai, August 5th, 1529, which was very advantageous to Charles in consequence of the impulsive character of Francis and his impatience to recover his children, whom he had surrendered to Charles in order to recover his liberty. So they signed a peace over here, and I actually highlighted Cambrai for you to show where the peace was signed. It's basically on the French and the German border. And also, his 2 children were hostage. So, Francis was, remember when we read that Francis was kidnapped? So in order to release himself, he gave up 2 of his children. And now he wanted the 2 children back. He agreed to pay 2 million of crowns for the ransom of his sons and renounce his pretensions in the Low Countries and Italy. That would be the Netherlands. He said, I'm no longer going to try to control the Netherlands or Italy. He's renouncing his claims. He, moreover, lost reputation and the confidence of Europe by the abandonment of his allies. Charles remained the arbiter of Italy and was attentive to the interests of all who adhered to him. With less chivalry than his rival, he had infinitely more honor. So, Charles V, even though he will stab you in the back, if he makes you a promise, he'll keep the promise. Cold, sagacious, selfish, and ambitious, he was, however, just and kept his word. He combined qualities we often see in selfish men: a sort of legal and technical regard to the letter of the law, with the constant violation of its spirit. A Shylock might not enter a false charge upon his books, while he would adhere to a most extortionate bargain. Charles, after the Treaty of Cambrai was signed, visited Italy with all the pomp of a conqueror. At Genoa, he honored Doria with many marks of distinction, and bestowed upon the Republic new privilege. Oh, Genoa is in northern Italy. Like, about there. Geneva. He settled all his difficulties with Milan, Venice, and Florence, and re-established the authority of the Medici. That's the powerful family that controlled Italy. He was then crowned by the Pope, whom he had trampled on, as King of Lombardy and Emperor of the Romans, and hastened into Germany, which imperatively required his presence, both on account of dissensions among the princes, which the Reformation caused, and the invasion of Austria by 300,000 Turks. So he has a lot to handle. He has Protestants revolting. Remember, Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, was sponsoring Luther. Luther was also in Thuringia, and you have the Turks attacking that empire. So he doesn't have time to be in Rome for too long. He resolved to recover the old prerogatives of the Emperor of Germany and crush those opinions which were undermining his authority, as well as the power of Rome, with which his own was identified. A diet, that's a congress or a gathering of the empire, was accordingly summoned at Spires in order to take into consideration the state of religion, the main cause of all the disturbances in Germany. It met in 1529, and the greatest address was required to prevent a civil war. All that Charles could obtain from the assembled princes was the promise to prevent any future innovations. A decree to that effect was passed, against which, however, the followers of Luther protested, the most powerful of whom were the Elector of Saxony, the Marquis of Brandenburg, the Landgrave of Hesse, the Duke of Lunenburg, the Prince of Anhalt, and the deputies of 14 imperial cities. Okay, I hope this is Protestant, the Saxony, right? I'm going to put an S there. Here is Brandenburg, so that's also Protestant. I'll just put a circle. And then we have the Landgrave of Hesse, who we'll see is an important father-in-law, and also imperial city. So I think Cologne is an imperial city. So we're just talking about cities all over Germany are embracing the Reformation, and they are protesting the decision of the Holy Roman Emperor and the Diet of Spires, which is the Congress of all the Nobles, to condemn Protestantism. But it's already established in northern Germany at this point. This protest gave to them the name of Protestants, a name ever since retained. Soon after, the Diet assembled at Augsburg, when the Articles of Faith among the Protestants were read, known as the Confession of Augsburg, which, however, the Emperor opposed. In consequence of his decree, the Protestant princes entered into a league at Smalcal to support one another and defend their religion. So, the reason I have this one place, it's really important because Luther studied at Erfurt, but it's a German state which is mostly forest. But Thuringia is important because Smalcald is also there, and Erfurt, and it's very important to Protestants. It's right in the middle of Germany, but this is where they agree all the Protestant princes will defend each other. And so there's no way the Holy Roman Empire is going to get rid of this heresy just because he wants more power and ambition. Soon after, the Diet assembled at Augsburg when the Articles of Faith among Protestants were read, known as the Confession of Augsburg, which, however, the Emperor opposed. Circumstances continually occurred to convince Charles that the extirpation of heresy by the sword was impossible in Germany, and moreover he saw it was for his interests, to which his eye was peculiarly open, to unite all the German provinces into a vigorous confederation. Accordingly, after many difficulties and with great reluctance, the terms of pacification were agreed upon at Nuremberg. So I believe that's in the south of Germany. But here's Augsburg. And that's where Protestantism is also established because they have Augsburg confessions, as I was saying. and ratified at the Diet at Ratisbon shortly thereafter, by which it was agreed that no person should be molested in his religion, and that the Protestants on their part should assist the emperor in resisting the invasion of the Turks. The Germans, with their customary good faith, furnished all the assistance they promised, and one of the best armies ever raised in Germany, amounting to 90,000 foot and 30,000 horse, took the field, commanded by the emperor in person. But the campaign ended without any memorable event, both parties having erred from excessive caution. So I think they try to invade. The Protestants promised to help him invade France, and it doesn't really go anywhere. Everyone just gets tired. Francis soon availed himself of the difficulties and dangers of his rival, formed an alliance with the Turks, put forth his old claims — remember they had an argument over Burgundy and the Netherlands — courted the favor of the German Protestants, and renewed hostilities. So they made peace at Cambrai, and very quickly now, France, which I'm kind of coloring as red, makes an alliance with the Turks. So anything to put pressure on your own enemy. And it's just funny because you will see often in European history, they do make alliances with the Moors, or they do make alliances with the Turks. And it's easy to imagine Christendom was united at some point, but there's a lot of practicality involved. And the Ottoman Empire was definitely courted by European empires. Francis, he marched towards Italy and took possession of the dominions of the Duke of Savoy, whom the emperor at this juncture was unable to assist on the account of his African expedition against the pirate Barbarossa. So the dark pencil being the Holy Roman Empire. He was busy attacking Tunisia and Algiers. And so that's why, because he was attacking there, I assume it would be from Spain, he was unable to do much when France decided to invade his country. Charles was terribly indignant and loaded his rival with such violent invectives, that's insults, that Francis challenged him to single combat. The challenge was accepted, but the duel was never fought. Charles, in his turn, invaded France with a large army, for that age, 40,000 foot and 10,000 horse, but the expedition was unfortunate. Francis acted on the defense with admirable skill, and was fortunate in his general Montmorency, who seemed to be possessed with the spirit of a Fabius. So, this was funny. The Holy Roman Empire, Charles, tries to invade, and France pushes him back, and it is a successful thing by France. And the reason is because his general was so good that it reminded this historian of the general who defended Italy against Hannibal's invasion, and that he was able to use guerrilla warfare and kind of wear down Hannibal without ever fighting an actual battle with him. So they said, oh man, you were so good, you were like the ancient Roman emperor, the generals. The emperor at last was compelled to return ingloriously, having lost half of his army without having gained a single important advantage. This is a recurring theme. This never goes anywhere. The joy of Francis, however, was embittered by the death of the Dauphin, that's his son and future heir and infant prince, attributed by some to the infamous Catherine de Medicis, wife of the Duke of Orleans, in order to secure the crown to her husband. I highlighted Orleans for that reason, but I may as well just go on to another map, because I feel like I don't want to give too much information. But Orleans is here, and so what's implied is that Orleans was trying to become, it's not too far from Paris. The Duke of Orleans was trying to secure the crown, and if the King Francis II, I think, did not have a son, then another duke would rule. So he was next in line. So Francis, and then here again would be Charles the Fifth. And obviously that's France. And as we know, this is the Holy Roman Empire. War did not end with the retreat of Charles, but was continued with great personal animosity until mutual exhaustion led to a truce for 10 years, concluded at Nice in 1538. So they are just wearing each other out, Charles and Francis, Charles and Francis. Both parties had exerted their utmost strength, and neither had obtained any signal advantage. Notwithstanding their open and secret enmity, they had an interview shortly after the truce, in which both vied with each other in expressions of esteem and friendship, and the exhibition of chivalrous courtesies, a miserable mockery as shown by the violation of the terms of the truce and renewal of hostilities in 1541. So it looks like it lasted about 3 years until they invaded each other all over again. They were doubtless facilitated by Charles's unfortunate expedition against Algiers in 1541, by which he gained nothing but disgrace. As I mentioned at the beginning, North Africa is important here. That is Tunisia, that is Algeria, with the capital of Algiers. And so they were trying to put down pirates in the Mediterranean. And he lost a lot of energy, did not have time to draw Africa there. Or it's really not the focus. But Africa is an important part of history at any century or millennia. His army was wasted by famine and disease, and a tempest destroyed his fleet. All the complicated miseries which war produces were endured by his unfortunate troops, but a small portion of whom ever returned. Francis, taking advantage of these misfortunes, made immense military preparations, formed a league with the Sultan Suleiman, and brought 5 armies into the field. He assumed the offensive and invaded Netherlands, but obtained no laurels. So again, France is being allied with the Turks to harass his enemy. Charles formed a league with Henry VIII, and the war raged with various success, without either party obtaining any signal advantage for 3 years, when a peace was concluded at Crespy in 1544. So 3 years of war, and then another peace. But at this point, Henry VIII, who's actually the subject of our next chapter, is reigning in England, and he's also very important to Christian history. Charles, being in the heart of France with an invading army, had the apparent advantage, but the difficulty of retreating out of France in case of disaster, and the troubles in Germany forced him to suspend his military operations. The Pope also was offended because he had conceded so much to the Protestants, and the Turks pressed him on the side of Hungary. So no one is happy with Charles. We may as well even add the Pope, because he has his own problems. Why aren't you putting down the heresy? Why are you letting the Protestants to remain your princes? Moreover, he was afflicted with the gout. That causes your knees to lock up because you're not drinking enough water. Also, sitting all day can do that. So make sure you stretch. But cab drivers tend to get it, or anyone who's driving all the time, which indisposed him for complicated enterprises. In view of these things, he made peace with Francis and formed a strong alliance with the Pope, and resolved to extirpate, to root out the Protestant religion, which was the cause of so many insurrections in Germany. In the meantime, the Pope resolved to assemble the famous Council of Trent, the legality of which the Protestants denied. So I found Trent because it's in northern Italy, and it looks like it's called Tridentium back in those days. But this council was probably the most important council of the Middle Ages, and there wasn't another council until Vatican II. but, Vatican I, excuse me, in the 1850s. But it was designed to combat Luther's heresy. It met in 1545 and was the last general council which the popes ever assembled. This book was written in 1849. I think the Vatican I was the 1880s. So this is why he's writing that there was no other church council in the Catholic Church. It met with a view of healing the dissensions of the church and confirming the authority of the Pope. The princes of Europe hoped that important reforms would have been made, but nothing of consequence was done, and the attention of the divines was directed to dogmas rather than morals. The great number of Italian bishops enabled the Pope to have everything his own way, in spite of the remonstrance of the German, Spanish, and French prelates, and the ambassadors of different monarchs, who also had seats in the council. The decrees of this council respecting articles of faith are considered as a final authority by the Roman Church. It denounced the reform of Luther and confirmed the various ecclesiastical usurpations which had rendered the Reformation necessary. The council, lasted 22 years at different intervals during the pontificate of 5 popes. The Jesuits, just rising into notice, had considerable influence in the council in consequence of the learning and ability of their representatives, especially of Lainez, the general of the order. The Dominicans and Franciscans manifested their accustomed animosities and rivalries, and questions were continually proposed and agitated which divided the assembly. The French bishops, headed by the Cardinal of Lorraine, were opposed to the high pretensions of the Italians, especially of Cardinal Moroni, the papal legate, but by artifice and management, the most strenuous adherents of the Pope attained their ends. About the time the council assembled died 3 distinguished persons: Henry VIII of England, Francis I, and Luther. Charles V was freed from his great rival, the only private person in his dominions he had reason to fear. He now, in good earnest, turned his attention to the internal state of the empire and resolved to crush the Reformation by force if it were necessary. So, we've been going over all these wars. Francis dies. And now he says, I'm going to crush the Protestants. And we will see the Protestant region of Saxony, again, Luther's patron. He's punished, the Frederick the Elector, and also other areas. But wait till you see how it ends. Everybody gets their due. He commenced by endeavoring to amuse and deceive the Protestants. That's Charles, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And evinced that profound dissimulation, which is a lifestyle of lying, which was one of his characteristics. He formed a strict alliance with the Pope and made a truce with Suleiman and won over to his side Maurice and the other German princes. So he makes the Pope happy and he makes the Turks happy. He's dealing with his enemies so he could crush the Protestants in his own country. His military preparations and his intrigues alarmed the Protestants, and they prepared themselves for a resistance. Religious zeal seconded their military ardor. One of the largest armies which had been raised in Europe for a century took the field, and Charles, shut up in Ratisbon, was in no condition to fight. So they almost had the emperor cornered. Unfortunately for the Protestants, they negotiated instead of acting. The emperor was in their power, but he was one of those few persons who remained haughty and inflexible in the midst of calamities. He pronounced the ban of the empire against the Protestant princes, who were no match for a man who had spent his life in the field. They acted without concert and committed many errors. Charles was a better general. He had fought all those wars with Francis, the first of France. Their forces decreased while those of the emperor increased by large additions from Italy and Flanders. That's his hometown, and Italy is obviously the Pope. The Pope is happy to give him soldiers to fight with. Instead of decisive action, the Protestants dallied and procrastinated, unwilling to make peace and unwilling to face their sovereign. Their army melted away, and nothing of importance was effected. Maurice, cousin to the Elector of Saxony, with a baseness to which history scarcely affords a parallel, deserted his allies. So Maurice's cousin, for one of the Protestant princes, the guy who sponsored Luther, and he stabs the Protestants in the back. Deserted his allies and joined the emperor purely from ambitious motives, and invaded the territories of his kinsmen with 12,000 men. The Confederates made overtures of peace, which being rejected, they separated, and most of them submitted to the emperor. He treated them with haughtiness and rigor, imposed on them most humiliating terms, forced them to renounce the League of Smalcald, to give up their military stores, to admit garrisons into their cities, occupied by troops, and to pay large contributions in money. The Elector of Saxony and the Landgrave of Hesse, however, held out. These guys were pretty important to Maurice. This is the Landgrave of Hesse, important cultural city, and this is Saxony, also a very important cultural city. Like I said, he sponsored Luther, and these guys were holding out against the Holy Roman Emperor, trying to make his country Catholic again. And such was the condition of the emperor that he could not immediately attack them. They were powerful princes in their own right. But the death of Francis gave him leisure to invade Saxony, and the elector, Frederick, who's Luther's sponsor, was defeated at the Battle of Mulhausen and taken prisoner. So, Saxony falls. And it's not fun because that's a cultural capital and they've always been independent. He was a very respectable and great prince. The captive prince approached the victor without sullenness or pride. "The fortune of war," said he, "has made me your captive, your prisoner, most gracious emperor, and I hope to be treated." Here Charles interrupted him. "And I am at last acknowledged to be emperor? Charles of Ghent was the only title you lately allowed me. So you never called me emperor, you never kissed my ring. You shall be treated as you deserve." At these words, he turned his back upon him with a haughty air. So Charles is not giving any mercy to one of the most powerful princes of his empire, Frederick the Elector of Saxony. The unfortunate prince was closely guarded by Spanish soldiers and brought to a trial before a court-martial, at which presided the infamous Duke of Alva, afterwards celebrated for his cruelties in Holland. He was convicted of treason and rebellion and sentenced to death, a sentence which no court-martial had a right to inflict on the first prince of the empire. He was treated with ignominious harshness, which he bore with great magnanimity, but finally made a treaty with the emperor, by which, for the preservation of his life, he relinquished his kingdom to Maurice. So, the guy who's a turncoat to the Protestants, he becomes ruler of Saxony. The traitor. The Landgrave was not strong enough to resist the power of Charles. That's the Landgrave of Hesse, over there on the left, circled in red. After all his enemies were subdued and he made his submission, though Charles extorted the most rigorous conditions, he, being required to surrender his person, abandon the League of Smalcald, and implore pardon on his knees, demolish his fortifications, and pay an enormous fine. So that's the Landgrave of Hesse who has to surrender and beg on his knees. In short, it was unconditional submission. But beside infinite mortifications, he was detained a prisoner, which on Charles' part was but injury added to insult, an act of fraud and injustice which inspired the prince and the Protestants generally with unbounded indignation. The Elector of Brandenburg and Maurice in vain solicited for his liberty. Brandenburg is to the north, again a very important cultural city to Germany, and they're saying, please let the Landgrave of Hesse go, and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V is saying, I won, I get to do what I want. But the emperor listened to their remonstrances with the most provoking coolness, and showed very plainly that he was resolved to crush all rebellion, suppress Protestantism, and raise up an absolute throne in Germany to the subversion of its ancient constitution. Back then, Germany was a couple hundred kingdoms, so he wanted to unite Germany. That would not happen until the 1850s with Otto von Bismarck. To all appearances, his triumph was complete. His great rival was dead. His enemies were subdued and humiliated. Luther's voice was hushed, and immense contributions filled the imperial treasury. He now began to realize the dreams of his life. He was unquestionably at that time the most absolute and powerful prince Europe has ever seen since Charlemagne, with the exception of Napoleon. But what an impressive moral does the history of human greatness convey? This is the funny part. The hour of triumph is often but the harbinger of defeat and shame. Pride goeth before destruction, as the scripture says. Charles V, with all his policy and experience, overreached himself. The failure of his ambitious projects and restoration of Protestantism were brought about by instruments the least anticipated. He had no idea what was coming. The cause of Protestantism and the liberties of Germany were endangered by the treachery of Maurice, who received as his reward the great electorate of Saxony. He had climbed, this is the traitor, to the summit of glory and power. Who would suppose that this traitor prince would desert the emperor who had so splendidly rewarded his services and return to the rescue of those princes whom he had so basely betrayed? But who can thread the labyrinth, the maze, of an intriguing and selfish heart? Who knows what goes on in the mind of a traitor? Who can calculate the movements of an unprincipled and restless politician? Maurice, at length, awoke to the perception of the real condition of his country. He saw its liberties being overturned by the most ambitious man whom 10 centuries had produced. He saw the cause, which his convictions told him was the true one, in danger of being wrecked. He was, moreover, wounded by the pride, coldness, and undisguised selfishness of the emperor. He was indignant that the Landgrave, his father-in-law, should be retained a prisoner, against all the laws of honor and justice. So, apparently, the Landgrave of Hesse was his father-in-law, and he was not happy that this guy was still being arrested, even though you took away his entire kingdom. He was still in jail. He formed his plans with the greatest coolness and exercised the power of dissimulation, lying, that has no parallel in history. But his address was even greater than this hypocrisy. He gained the confidence of the Protestants without losing that of the emperor. He had even obtained the command of an army which Charles sent to reduce the rebellious city of Magdeburg, and while he was besieging the city, he was negotiating with the generals who defended it for a general union against the emperor. Magdeburg surrendered in 1551. Its chieftains were secretly assured that the terms of capitulation should not be observed. His next point was to keep the army together until his schemes were ripened, and then to arrest the emperor, whose thoughts now centered on the Council of Trent. So the Catholic Church is having its ecumenical council in Trent, and he's thinking, well, I just got to get this over with since I already sacked all the Protestants, and I don't have to worry anymore since I'm going to be the greatest ruler in German history. So he proposed sending Protestant divines to the council, this is Maurice, but delayed their departure by endless negotiations about the terms of a safe conduct. He, moreover, formed a secret treaty with Henry II, the successor of Francis, whose animosity against Charles was as intense as was that of his father. So even though Francis dies, we have Henry, I guess this is the Dauphin, the second. And now, Charles doesn't realize that his enemy is strong again. When his preparations were completed, he joined his army in Thuringia. Again, that's central Germany. And this is where Luther was at Erfurt and where the League of Smalcald was. But it's also a forest state. So it's really cool that so much of Protestant action goes on in Thuringia. and took field against the emperor, who had no suspicion of his designs, who blindly trusted to him, deeming it impossible that a man whom he had so honored and rewarded could turn against him. So Maurice finally goes to war against the man who he betrayed his Protestant allies for, and who gave him control of Saxony, but arrested his father-in-law. So he's a double agent, basically. He betrayed first the Protestants, and then he betrays Charles V. March 18, 1552, Maurice published his manifesto justifying his conduct, and his reasons were to secure the Protestant religion, to maintain the constitution of the empire, and deliver the Landgrave of Hesse from bondage, his father-in-law. He was powerfully supported by the French king, the son of Francis I, and with a rapidly increasing army marched towards Innsbruck, where the emperor was quartered, living. The emperor was thunderstruck when he heard the tidings of his desertion, and was in no condition to resist him. He endeavored to gain time by negotiations, but these were without effect. Maurice, at the head of a large army, advanced rapidly into Upper Germany. Castles and cities surrendered as he advanced, and so rapid was his progress that he came near to taking the emperor captive. Charles was obliged to fly in the middle of the night and to travel on a litter by torchlight amid the passes of the Alps. So there's mountains in Switzerland and also northern Italy. So the emperor is running for his life through these mountains. The emperor, after a while, was obliged to make peace with them, for his Spanish subjects were disgusted with the war, and his funds were exhausted, his forces dispersed, and territories threatened by the French. So Spain doesn't want to be paying for all these wars. That's what they've been doing since he's been emperor. In 1552 was concluded the Peace of Passau, which secured the return of the Landgrave to his dominions, the freedom of religion to the Protestants, and the preservation of the German constitution. The sanguine hopes of the emperor were dispelled, and all his ambitious schemes defeated, and he left to meditate in the intervals of the pains which he suffered from the gout. His knees are hurting and locking up, on the instability of all greatness, and the vanity of human life. So that's so funny. He lost everything, and now he's thinking about, again, the instability of all greatness and the vanity of human life. He's been working his whole life to become ruler of Germany and become an absolute ruler. And he almost succeeded, but this guy Maurice turned his back on him and stabbed him in the back, and he saved the Protestant faith. Maurice was now extolled as extravagantly as he had been before denounced, and his treachery justified even by grave divines, that's serious theologians. But what is most singular in the whole affair was that the French king, while persecuting Protestants at home, should protect them abroad. Again, the same way the French king was allied with the Turks, the French king was allied with the Protestants in order to break up his rival in the Holy Roman Emperor. But this conduct may confirm in a signal manner the great truth of history, that God regulates the caprice of human emotions, and that makes them subservient to the accomplishment of his own purposes. So God planned all this. He's saying that the Holy Roman Emperor should overreach, and then his own double agent should cause his downfall. The labors and perplexities of Charles V were not diminished by the Treaty of Passau. He continued his hostilities against the French and against the Turks. He was obliged to raise the siege of Metz, which was gallantly defended by the Duke of Guise. Did I find Metz? I don't think I did. To his calamities in France were added others in Italy. Siena revolted against his government, and Naples was threatened by the Turks. The imperialists were unsuccessful in Italy and in Hungary, and the Archduke Ferdinand was obliged to abandon Transylvania. So he's losing everywhere. Transylvania is Romania. But war was carried on in the Low Countries with considerable vigor. Charles, whose only passion was the aggrandizement of his house, now projected a marriage of his son, Philip, with Mary, Queen of England. This is Catholic Mary. The Queen, dazzled by the prospect of marrying the heir of the greatest monarch in Europe, and eager to secure his powerful aid to reestablish Catholicism in England, listened to his proposal, although it was disliked by the nation. In spite of the remonstrance, which is no, of the House of Commons, the marriage treaty was concluded and the marriage celebrated in 1554. We'll see what happens there. Shortly after, Charles formed the extraordinary resolution of resigning his dominions to his son and of retiring to a quiet retreat. And I actually kind of looked up. So this is where this poor guy goes. He leads wars his whole life, and then he just decides to retire in sunny, what we would call northern Italy. He is just tired of all of this because his greatest ambition of his life failed, to become the absolute ruler of Germany. Diocletian is the only instance of a prince capable of holding the reins of government who had adopted a similar course. That, of course, was the Roman emperor who stepped down, I think. All Europe was astonished at the resolution of Charles, and all historians of the period have moralized on the event. But it ceases to be mysterious when we remember that Charles was no nearer to the accomplishment of the ends which animated his existence, that he was 30 years before, than he was 30 years before. So he's been fighting for 30 years and he hasn't gained any territory. That he severely suffered from the gout, which at times incapacitated him for the government of his extensive dominions. It was never his habit to entrust others with the duties and labors which he could perform himself, and he felt that his empire needed a more powerful protector than his infirmities, weaknesses, and illness permitted him to be. He was grown prematurely old. He felt his declining health, longed for repose, and sought religious consolation. Of all his vast possessions, he only reserved an annual pension of 100,000 crowns, resigning Spain and the Low Countries, what his father gave him, into the hands of Philip, and the Empire of Germany to his brother Ferdinand, who had already been elected as king of the Romans. He then set out for his retreat in Spain. Oh, okay, so it's in Spain, not southern Italy. That's just another Placentia. Near Placentia, which situated in a lovely valley, surrounded with lofty trees, watered by a small brook, and rendered attractive by the fertility of the soil and the delightful temperature of the climate. Here he spent his last days in agricultural improvements and religious exercises, apparently regardless of that noisy world which he had deserted forever, and indifferent to those political storms which his restless ambition had raised. Here his grandeur and his worldly hopes were buried in preparing himself for the future world. He lived with great simplicity for 2 years after his retreat and died 1558 from the effects of the gout, which added to his great labors had shattered his constitution. He was not what the world would call a great genius like Napoleon, but he was a man of great sagacity, wisdom, untiring industry, and respectable attainments. He was cautious, cold, and selfish, had but little faith in human virtue, and was a slave in his latter days to superstition. He was neither affable nor courteous, but was sincere in his attachments and munificent in rewarding his generals and friends. He was not envious nor cruel, but inordinately ambitious and intent on aggrandizing, increasing the size of his family. This was his characteristic defect, and this in a man so prominent and so favored by circumstances was enough to keep Europe in turmoil for nearly half a century. The next chapter will be on Henry VIII, and it is quite delightful because England is a very interesting history of its own. But thank you so much for watching, and have a great day or night wherever you are.